Evening, everyone. I'm Jonathan Merritt Nash, an associate professor in the Department of History at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. It is my honor to welcome you this evening to Hope in the Struggle, a conversation with Dr. Josie Johnson. Tonight's event was made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, the McCarthy Center, the Global Business Leadership Department, Anderson Corporation, the History Department, the Honors Program, the Black Student Association, and the Political Science Department. Before we begin, please know that there will be time for questions toward the end of the conversation. If you have questions for Dr. Johnson, please click the Ask the Question button near the bottom of your screen. You might need to exit out of the full screen view to see the Ask the Question button. Now, please welcome my friend and colleague, Dr. Deborah Pembleton, who is an associate professor in the Global Business Leadership Department and the director of the Asian Studies program. Deborah?
Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this evening's event with Dr. Josie Johnson, who will be interviewed by Dr. Ken Jones. I have been asked to provide a bit of background regarding how this talk came about. Over the past few years, Dr. Jones and I have discussed a book that he uses in one of his classes entitled Coming of Age in Mississippi, a memoir by Anne Moody, published in the 1960s about the fight for civil rights in Mississippi. Much of the book is based in my hometown of Canton, Mississippi, and many of the people in the book were parents and grandparents of my classmates, friends, and neighbors. In a subsequent conversation with Dr. Jonathan Nash, upon the release of Dr. Johnson's book, Hope in the Struggle, we decided to bring Dr. Johnson to our community. We have subtitled tonight's event as Coming of Age in Minnesota, to reflect the tremendous work that Dr. Johnson has done right here in Minnesota. And now I'd like to turn it over to the College of St. Benedict Interim President, Laurie M. Heyman, to share a short welcome.
Thank you. Welcome everyone to this virtual discussion, Hope in the Struggle, a conversation between Dr. Josie Johnson and Dr. Ken Jones, sponsored by the McCarthy Center. I want to thank each and every one of you who've been responsible for planning this wonderful event. I'm Laurie Heyman, president of the College of St. Benedict, and it's an honor to gather virtually today to hear from Dr. Johnson, one of the most well-known civil rights activists in Minnesota, having spent 7 decades fighting for fairness in voting, housing, education, and employment. Dr. Johnson's legacy is extraordinary, and her book, if you have not read it yet, is incredible. This event was originally scheduled for March, which feels to me like a lifetime ago. In the last 7 months, COVID-19 has served as its own example of the ongoing need for Dr. Johnson's work of social justice, as Black, Indigenous, and people of color are more likely than white people to die from COVID-19. And further, the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and many others have reminded us that people of color are disproportionately likely to experience police violence. And our current political rhetoric has turned civil rights into a political issue. Dr. Johnson, thank you for your decades of work in social justice in our state. Thank you for your leadership and your advocacy in higher education particularly. And thank you for being with us to share your memoir and your hope. Your message, your history, your future, it's critical to us. We need your message now, even more than we did in March. You, Dr. Johnson, have been described as a tenacious fighter for justice with values grounded in love and grace. And in that same spirit of learning, listening, love, and grace inspired by our founders, we heartily welcome you to this discussion tonight. As a community of learners that are learning to live out this mission of the places that we call home, may we emulate your incredible life, which is in the best sense of the word, filled with Benedictine values and action, contributing immensely to justice and peace, community, and stability and love of learning. We are honored, Dr. Johnson, to have you with us virtually at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University today. We welcome you and your incredible message of hope. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Gene McAllister, the interim president of St. John's University, and he'll add his words of welcome. Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, for being with us.
Good evening. I'm Eugene McAllister, as mentioned, interim president at St. John's, and I'd like to welcome all of you to the Eugene J. McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement. Tonight, we honor Dr. Josie Johnson, and we do so by making her answer questions. However, in our defense, we ask these questions because we are hungry to learn, and there is so much for Dr. Johnson to teach us, to help us learn. Learning and teaching are central to Dr. Johnson's life and central to our lives here at St. John's and St. Benedict's. We are so honored to have Dr. Johnson among us because we at St. John's and St. Benedict's seek to learn deeply, not just formulas and theories, but to prepare our students for life's big questions. Two such questions that Dr. Johnson helps all of us with are, how can we more fully see the dignity of each person and honor that dignity through civil rights and human rights? And second, how does one come to lead a meaningful life, a good life, a life with purpose? And we see Dr. Josie Johnson as someone who has learned deeply and lived faithfully. We want to ask her these questions because we seek to be as courageous, as powerful, and as loving as she. Hope in the Struggle is a remarkable book with many extraordinary accomplishments offered in a very understated way. But what comes through so strongly is Dr. Johnson's love and affection for universities. Fisk University, where learning and new ideas could be tested. Texas Southern, where she felt her calling as a teacher. University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she received her doctorate. And of course, the University of Minnesota, and her truly historic figure as an administrator and a regent. Clearly, university life is very important to Dr. Johnson, and we're grateful she is joining our university and college this evening. But there's yet another affinity related to education. At age 78, Dr. Johnson took a year as principal at St. Peter Claver Parish School. Peter Claver, for those who don't know, is the patron saint of those enslaved and of civil rights. Here at St. John's and St. Benedict's, two other Catholic institutions, we recognize what you did, Dr. Johnson. You inspire us, and we admire you. Dr. Johnson, we are so glad you are here. Thank you. And lastly, Professor Ken Jones.
Thank you. Dr. Johnson, we finally get to have this talk. I mean, it's been a long time coming, and I'm so happy that we get to do it. For our listeners who haven't read your book, I'd like to point out that you were born in 1930, and since the date was October the 7th, I think it's still legitimate for me to wish you a belated 90th birthday. Still at least in the same month. You grew up primarily in Houston when Texas and the rest of the South was still a segregated society where both custom and law kept African Americans in a very subservient position. You were, however, enveloped in a strong and talented family surrounded by a larger African American community. Your mother was a community leader and your father was the first Black realtor in Houston and the first to own an insurance agency. None of this is new to you. I'm telling this for the people who haven't read the book yet. In his spare time, in your father's spare time, he was active in the Urban League and in the NAACP, and took you canvassing with a petition for a repeal of the poll tax. Now, for those of you who aren't sort of up on this, the chances of success on that are between slim and none, but it's a great symbolic gesture to say that you're not happy with the situation. Your parents encourage self-confidence in their children. Clearly, you can see that in your story, and they chose to send you to historically Black Catholic schools. From there, as Dr. McAllister pointed out, you went on to Fisk, one of the most prestigious HBCUs in the country. You went in 1947 when you were still 16. I've talked enough. It's time to ask some questions and let you tell the story. So my first question is, if you could look at where we are now through the eyes of that young woman at Fisk in the late 1940s, what would she say? Given the world she lived in, would she be surprised at where we are now, or sort of frustrated at what we haven't done? How would she see the world looking at it from that late 1940s perspective?
Dr. Jones, I sincerely appreciate the opportunity to thank my wonderful colleagues who introduced me to this session tonight. And I thank Dr. Pemberton for her insistence that I return to St. John's. It was a sincere and deeply felt appreciation when I was invited. And I am looking forward tonight to our conversation. I thank you for the lead up to the conversation tonight. And I hope that you will accept the fact, community, that I am willing, interested, and eager to have us talk together, to talk honestly, to see if we have issues that we need to explore more deeply, and to be engaged with each other. So once again, thank you. Thank you all for that very kind introduction, and I'm honored to be here tonight. I think you asked, did I notice anything different from then and now?
Well, I was trying to imagine a 16-year-old at Fisk and how the world looked then and how it might look now to her. I mean, what vision of the future did you have at that point? What expectations?
Thank you. And I appreciate you restating it for me.
My pleasure.
Fisk University was acknowledged as one of the first colleges of higher education for Black people. It was well known not only for the scholars who were there, who taught not only literature, but all of the other sciences as well, who were people with skill for music and history and chemistry and all of the component parts that made a people, us, African American people. And we were blessed to have the scholarship that was there of the famous people that you read about now, W.B. Du Bois, John Hope Franklin, etc. When I went to Fisk, I was so excited because I had heard so much about it, and my family had talked so proudly about that great institution and what its history was for us as a people. So arriving at Fisk and having, I'm sorry, I hope that I tried to unplug the phone and I hope it's not disturbing you. When I arrived there and had these young Black men helping me put my luggage in a truck and take it to Fisk University, it was such a joy. I remember how excited I was about being there. about going into one of the buildings that we had heard so much about. Going into the arrangement of that building and looking at the photographs of so many Black historians. So for me, it was such a joy. I loved it from the moment I arrived and love it still. So it was a place that we'd heard about, and it proved to be everything that we were told and more.
And you met your future husband there.
That's correct.
So an additional bonus.
And not only that, my oldest deceased daughter was the first president of the student organization at Fisk and did very well academically, as well as following in the tradition of the institution. And yes, my husband, who then left Fisk and went to MIT to get his master's in mathematics and engineering.
And I wanted to ask you about sort of the next step in your life there. That you and your husband, Chuck, both grew up with strong family and community support. And then in 1956, you moved to a very white Minnesota and tried to find a place for yourself while you were very soon raising 3 small children. I think some of our students might at some point end up with a sort of a similar experience where they leave a very comfortable environment to go off into a place where it's not so welcoming. It's surrounded by people who are not as warm and comforting. So I wondered if you could talk about that transition, how you very dramatically and quickly, has already been alluded, inserted yourself into the Minnesota scene, made a way for yourself. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you did that and maybe give our students some guidance of the kinds of things that would help them move forward if they end up in a similar situation.
Well, thinking about our move to Boston, Massachusetts, my husband accepting a scholarship at MIT, and our finding a place to live. We were directed to a Black family in Boston who were from Arkansas, a family that welcomed us. They had a daughter whose husband was in the military, who lived in that building, that apartment building that the family owned. And we were given a very comfortable, nice space in that set of apartments. The daughter and I became friends, and I was able to spend time with her during a period when I was recuperating from an illness. That experience of that Arkansas family and the acceptance of us as members of their family helped us, in my judgment, feel comfortable and a part of our Black history. My husband then became a full-time student at MIT, and I had, for a moment or a little while, I worked at Harvard in a project that it required my training because my major was chemistry, and I had done work in mathematics and in the field that qualified me to accept the position at MIT. It took a while to really understand this new environment that we lived in. but we were students and we met other Black students who were doing their graduate study there at MIT. Couple of those families became very close family members to us. And so they assisted us in that sense of belonging. We also, my husband developed a close relationship with one of his classmates, and we learned that cultural history. It was a young Jewish student who could then share with us some of the attitudes that he had adjusted to in his graduate studies. We learned, I became engaged with my sorority. There was a chapter there. I'm a member of the Delta Sigma Theta sorority. And there was a chapter there in Boston. And I was able to get connected with them and serve as president for a period of time that I was there. Also, I found that I could be engaged with some of the teachers, Black teachers in the public schools there in Boston. So it gave me an opportunity to share the sense of being Black and learning and teaching these students and others about our ancestral history and being engaged. I found myself very much a part of my community there in Boston. I had that opportunity. And my husband was a very serious and hardworking student. So the relationship we developed with those other Black students at MIT was not only a sense of belonging to a group of people and not losing contact with our people while we continued our work. So yes, we were there through the birth of our first daughter, our now deceased daughter. Charles was going to University of Michigan to select, to accept a position there, and was called into the service. He got drafted as we were moving. So we were in Massachusetts, Charles as a student, I as an employee at Harvard for a brief time, and engaged in the social organization of African American, our social and political and cultural organization that existed there, and to have been lucky enough to be engaged with this couple from Arkansas. Yes. That helped us translate our cultural, historical training and feel comfortable about it was a real blessing.
You mentioned that your interest in education in that last little bit for, as you shifted away from the sciences. And I wanted to follow that. Your mother was a educational innovator, and you had an ongoing interest in African American education, and eventually you decided to pursue a doctorate at age 51, which strikes me as a marvelously courageous thing to do, and maybe an example to all of us to know that it's never too late to take on a challenge. In grad school, your focus was on the history of education, particularly African American education, and how racism destroys a sense of self-worth and the capacity to dream in young children. And the most poignant passage in that section of the book for me was one on 258, where you talk about seeing young boys walking with joy and pride, and then, quote, after a few years of attending school and being told they could not do, after a few years of attending school and being told what they could not do, their heads would bow. They seemed to lose confidence and bend over as they walked. You could see the pride drain from them as they came to embody the expectations and stereotypes of the majority culture. Can you talk a little bit, I'm moving you out of the past and into the present here if I can. Could you talk a little bit about some of the things that you see that we need to do to reverse this, things you've been involved in or things that you see more generally? And I think as probably everyone watching knows, we have a very large and very persistent educational achievement gap in Minnesota. And if you could, give us some perspective on that. I mean, I know you've been involved in a ton of efforts to improve education. So help us out and see where we should be going.
Well, let's talk about that, because I appreciate your sensitivity to our need to really focus and think about the whole issue of education and our children and their future and what our hopes are and what our ancestors hoped for. I remember so clearly when I went, and I'm just going to touch on that experience I had as I watched these young Black children. I was a graduate student there at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And while I was there and working on my advanced degree, I also had a chance to teach in the public school there in Springfield, Massachusetts, just outside of Amherst, where I was. And I became very involved and interested in watching our children. They were being bused in from Springfield, Mass, into the school system there. And I began to feel this sense that so many of our children experience then and experience now. And that's the sense that they are visitors, not residents of the area, or they don't really belong there. They're sort of being tolerated. And I remember that sense of real deep hurt and frustration, and felt the need to be engaged in work that lifted the spirit of our children, help them understand the historical history that we have as a people and the efforts that our ancestors made in education, and sort of giving them a sense of their history. That's what we knew, what we understood, and what we felt needed to be shared. And I remember creating these programs for young Black people and working even with my peers in the graduate program to understand what we're talking about when we talk about equal education opportunity. So that experience in Massachusetts and working with those young people encouraged me to move into a more purposeful program in education and studying what it meant. What was education and what were we trying to teach, and how do you lift young Black children who are sort of covered over, made to feel different, being bused from one school environment to another, and not feeling the sense that their ancestors intended education to give them. So that experience in Amherst, working with our children who were coming into my environment of education and my need to be carefully observant of what was going on, encouraged me then to redirect the education interests that I had and to be mindful of the need to lift our children and to teach what we knew was a part of our Black historical history, not what was being presented at that time, but to go back and really teach our African American history and the effort that our ancestors played in education. Our slave parents and grandparents taught us from the very beginning the value of education because they knew the value, and they taught their children to read, even though I have images of our ancestors having to cover their physical body as they taught children, our African American children, how to read, how to do the kind of academic work that was required to keep the slave masters and white America from placing so much negativity around the education and making our children feel that that's not a part of their natural development. So the experience of actually seeing how children can be affected by an environment that does not support them, that makes them feel, I never will forget some of the feeling I had there in the school where I was teaching during my graduate study, having to perform, and I think I mentioned that in my book, having to perform for their classmates and for teachers to give them a sense of value, and not perform academically, but in the silliness to make people laugh and give them a sense of value. So that really became a very permanent. What I think teachers need, and I believe we have missed the opportunity to do it well, and that's give them the information about Black people and education and our engagement in the development of education and our value that we've placed in education. And what I think teachers need is to have that deep sense of respect for our people and our education and our contribution in the field of the academy, and remember that history as we deal with our children. Even today, as you indicated earlier or said earlier, those behaviors exist today. And it's a constant effort on the part of Black educators, Black families, Black communities to give our children the sense of value that we know they have. but everything around them and all of us is one we have to constantly remember and struggle, remind ourselves, remind our children, be engaged in policies and programs that will offer the kind of confidence that our children need to be the scholars that so many of them are.
Thank you.
Did I go too far off?
Well,
Doctor?
no, as a historian, I'm delighted to hear you talk about the importance of teaching the history part. So
Thank you.
that's marvelous. Let me lead us into another area here, since we have I'm sure we'll have questions, and I want to make sure we have time for that. You were friends with Dorothy Height, who was an enormously influential champion for African Americans, and particularly African American women, basically in the generation before you. You quote her in the book, this is on page 65, as saying, we must never lose sight of the quiet revolution that women are involved in. That in the long term will make all the difference. And then you follow that by writing, she was right. So what I would like you to talk about, if you will, is what were you thinking when you wrote that she was right? What should our audience know about the role of women in the ongoing struggle to bring African Americans to a place of equality in society?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because Dorothy Height was a woman who was a trailblazer. She early on in her professional life was engaged in work that dealt with courage and strength of women. She was very active with the YWCA and the first Black administrator for the YW. In my years of growing up, I was fortunate to serve on the board of a national sorority board, Delta Sigma Theta. Dorothy and I served on that board together. And when she decided to follow in the tradition of a Black women's organization, I became engaged in that as well. Dorothy was one of those people who believed in bringing women together because she felt women truly had not only the commitment of the issues dealing with civil rights and children and policy, but also could bring together other women and create an environment of women working for women and children for the right of social justice and civil rights. So during the time that she was serving in the national role as president of the National Council of Negro Women, Dorothy invited me to help organize a National Council of Negro Women in Minneapolis and to serve as president of that chapter. During that time, we were able to recruit Black women in Minnesota to know more about our history as a Black people and as Black women, and to be engaged in programs and projects that dealt with Black children in the state of Minnesota. Dorothy began to notice in consultation with many of her non-Black friends, the National Council of Jewish Women and Christian Women and others, she paid very close attention to the fact that there were many things in the whole work of civil rights that needed to be done, but that much of the attention and work for these rights and this just society that we were working for, that they were principally being done by men. And whereas that was not a negative, she also wanted, however, us to know that women could be very engaged in the civil rights struggle. So Dorothy invited a group of women to talk about this project. And in several northern states, they really felt it was important for women to go to these southern communities and learn about what was going on in the effort of justice, and to come back to their communities and get engaged in equal justice and to talk about it out loud. Women talking about it, being active and being engaged. And she invited me as a part of the Minnesota delegation to go to Mississippi. And we collected 3 other women, women with whom I had worked, one Christian, one Jewish, and the 2 Black women, me and Mary Kyle, who was editor of a Black weekly newspaper here, and invited us to go to Jackson, Mississippi, and to be engaged in work there, in what our people were doing and the suffering of our Black community as a result of their effort for justice and equality and the need to vote. Just that whole fear that white America had of Black people registering to vote. So we had an opportunity, the 4 of us, the 2 Black women stayed with a Black family in Jackson, and our Jewish and Christian women stayed with white families there to get that kind of understanding of what was going on in the white community. And just as kind of an aside, there was a need for the white friends to be very careful with whom they shared this experience, to not even have the women from the North, with, as one of the people shared with us, our speech gave us away, and that was an issue for some. But to be very careful about the work that needed to be done and the method of going about it. And so we had the great privilege of traveling in Jackson and just outside of Jackson, Mississippi. And you'll remember that in 1954, all the public schools were closed, and Black children then had to go to the kind of academies that Black educators developed, and in not only vacant buildings and libraries, etc., but the whole effort of trying to register to vote. And so we had, in the time that we were there, an opportunity to physically experience what our people experience day in and day out. We had the privilege of going to efforts, to see efforts that were being made to create academic environments for our children. And I share in there, looking at one of the libraries that had been created by young white and Black students, bringing books, organizing them, and placing them in these academies that had to be created for Black children. And we visited one of those, and the night following one of our visits, the Klan burned that building down. We had an opportunity to visit and see other efforts that were being made. The spiritual community, for example, I had an opportunity to visit with a priest who was very active, but fearful of announcing his engagement with his congregation, as most of the spiritual leaders of that area, they did not talk about the injustice in their church public sessions. And yet they were able to meet with our delegation and talk about it and share their fear and frustration. So we were able to go to a court, watch what went on, the way our young Black children were treated in court, the effort that many adults were making, all adults were making, to try to create opportunity to register to vote. Those were things that we could see with our own eyes, hear with our own ears, talk about it, and bring that information back to our community.
And
that
because
was
you had
widely.
and because you had a mixed group, you could come back and spread that more widely, I assume.
No, because it was classified as secret information, and it created a sense of fear for the work that was being attempted in those southern states. Right. And so, no, it took a while before we wrote it up and sent it to the national headquarters of Dorothy's group and the legislature, but we could not organize, recruit, get citizens to really work with us in creating the kind of information that was needed about what was going on in, at least in our southern state of Mississippi, and what was happening with the residents and the children, and the desire to register to vote, and our children's desire to go to school, and have all of that shut down as a result of prejudice and discrimination.
Thank you. We're running long on the time right now, so I'm going to do something. I don't know whether this will work or not, but I wanted to raise a question with you and then maybe let the audience pick up on it and follow up. And if not, I will come back and bother you again with it. But you titled the epilogue to your autobiography, Our Abiding Hope, which I think is marvelous. And in that section, you write, quote, "My generation understands why our children are impatient and continue to demonstrate against injustice. They will become ancestors themselves one day, and they too must believe that there is hope in the struggle," which is, to me, a marvelous John Lewis kind of statement. Very much in the good trouble mode that you continue to struggle. Your book was published before the events of last spring, so I'm wondering how the killings, the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery have affected your perspective, that 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 there is hope in the struggle, as opposed to despair about the continued disaster. And I'm just going to open that up, and I'll give you about maybe 2 minutes to start it, and then we can open it up to the audience, if that's okay with you.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm eager to hear from the audience. So I hope they are ready to be engaged in that. That's a critical question. And the reason it was something I had to work on, to remember my own prayer about hope in the struggle. What I experienced with George Floyd was to actually have the world see him murdered. We knew it. We know about it. Black people have known it. Civil rights people have known it. But to see it, to actually see it, and to have a police officer look comfortable killing him was perhaps the biggest shock that I had to get over. The fact, however, that the world responded to that reminded me that the world often responds, but holding on, keeping that message before the world and encouraging people to continue to fight for justice is very hard. It doesn't last. And Breonna Taylor, to me, how can anyone explain her death? And yet it continues to happen. It doesn't get the attention, but Black women and Black men are killed every day. And sometimes, unfortunately, human beings have to see other human beings suffering and identify their suffering with their own understanding in order to encourage them to get out and fight. Stay engaged. Don't let it pass. And that's kind of where I am now, and I'm holding on. And I have friends who keep reminding me of the need to continue to have faith. And my own children and grandchildren offer me that because they're all engaged in one way or another in the struggle of our ancestors and in the effort to make their environment and our people more appreciated and respected. And they're all, which is, you know, when you think about it as a great grandma and realize that your children, I don't remember having to sit and lecture to my children. My parents didn't sit and lecture to my brothers and to me. They lived it. They showed us. Even though we have to continue to hope, and each generation picks up where the other generation was and continues. So I hope the young people at St. John's and St. Kate will keep us in mind, keep the struggle, know what we're trying to do, because without that next generation picking up the struggle, we're gonna unfortunately have to do it all over again. And when I had the opportunity to be at St. Benedict's, it was it meant a lot to me, and I'm grateful. And I'm grateful we're all together tonight. So ask the questions. Let's talk together and see if I've got false hope or real hope. Thank you.
Great. I will stop monopolizing you now and let other people have the fun. Jonathan, are you doing the questions?
I've got the first one here.
Okay. Deborah.
What is your advice for the new generation of activists?
I think it's critical that activists know the history of the struggle, to learn what works and what doesn't work, to pay attention to government policy and understand how to make things happen in a way that affects the system and the society, and to know what you're doing, understand what you're doing, and to be doggedly committed to the struggle. Because until we remember that the slave masters had to teach the world that they enslaved our ancestors and treated them the way they did because the slave masters needed them, but also needed to justify their abuse. And then the next steps had to be legislation, policy, custom. So our young people in college today really must know American history. They need to know it, ask questions, to study it, and to talk together, not be embarrassed or ashamed for having to ask questions, talk to each other. The society has incorporated the abuse of Black people so well that many don't understand from whence it has come and what we need to know in order to be the people we need to be and encourage freedom and justice and equality.
Dr. Johnson, we have another question from the audience. Who are a few current figures that give you hope for the future generations of African Americans?
What you're asking, what's the first part?
The audience member was curious about who are some people today that give you hope for the future generations?
Oh, thank you very much. Well, I must admit that there are many Black historians and activists throughout our history that continue to give me hope. The most current people are, I think you would agree, President Obama, who, in my judgment, I never will forget, and I'll share this with you. When President Obama announced that he had been approached about the possibility of his running for the President of the United States, President Obama and my son-in-law were friends. Senator Obama and my son-in-law were friends. And I happened to be in the environment when Senator Obama and my son-in-law talked about the request that was out there regarding his running for the presidency. I said unashamedly to my son-in-law, that will never happen. We are not ready in America for a Black president. America will not consider him at all. Fortunately, my son-in-law ignored me and my prediction and worked very hard at raising money and having all kinds of public events to share what he knew about President Obama. That lifted my spirit to know that I had lived long enough that my prediction that America would never elect a Black man may not be true. It meant we had a lot of overcoming to do, and we had a lot of hard work to do, but it appeared to be possible. So I must admit, excuse me, that I had to overcome my own history of our struggle and the teaching that had been so widely given to everybody in white America, in America, that I had to overcome that and believe that perhaps we were in a different time.
Our next question is, what sticks out to you about the community organizing within the vibrant Native American community in Minneapolis?
When am I going to be able to hear from the audience? I'd love to hear them share with me some of what they are thinking in addition to their questions. Is that going to be possible tonight? Debbie, I'm just wondering if some of the audience might like to talk out loud, ask questions, and engage me in conversation. I don't want it to just be, they ask me, I answer. They ask me, I answer. I would really like to see if any of them are interested in us talking together. I really want to know, how are our young people thinking about some of this? I keep sharing with you what I think and what I hope and what I've been fighting for. Tell me a little bit about you, students, at one of our prestigious Catholic institutions where we teach in our Catholicism fairness and justice and love. Is it working?
Just one moment.
I don't mean to upset. It may go way off your time frame. So I believe I have been very much engaged in the study and engagement and work of all of our ethnic groups. When I was at the University of Minnesota, we had our African American Studies department. I then helped create the American Indian Department, the Women Department, Asian, and other ethnic group departments at the university. And so I am very committed to the whole concept and idea of us having a chance to talk to each other, to learn our history, to appreciate the difference that we bring to this democracy, and to create an environment in which everybody feels a part of the American democracy. So the American Indian community, I have always felt, was the community that led the way. It taught us all, and it took a long time for the whole system to appreciate, but taught us the value of our world that we live in and ways of taking care of it and being engaged in it. And I have had the blessing of being at a time at the university when we had a group of our American Indian professional and legal community to meet on our campus and to have conferences that talked about methods and rationale for the kind of justice that needed to be modeled and demonstrated. So I am hopeful that our community continues to acknowledge, to study, to actively be engaged in justice and equality for all of our people.
So Dr. Johnson, in response to having a broader participation from the audience, we're not really set up for that
All
in
right.
this session, but that means that we will have to have you back for
And
a longer campus conversation.
I'll happily come back, and this time we'll have the weather as pleasant as it is now, right, Debbie?
I certainly will count on that, yes.
Yes, I too. It would be my honor to come back. I would love that. Thank you.
Wonderful. We do have another couple of questions for you. Let's see, are you taking that one, Jonathan, or am I?
Could take it, Deborah.
Let's see. Some people I know do not believe that people of color still face hardship and discrimination. How can I make them aware that there is still more work to be done?
Well, you know, in some situations and in an academic setting like you have there, you might just look at the statistics of observing people unemployed or poorly employed. Just look at the current situation we're in. I think Dr. Jones mentioned in the beginning that the pandemic has shown us the impact of a society that still treats us differently than the majority group. Our people are still those that, when they say stay home, don't go out, that's not possible for us. Our people are the ones who have shown the effects of a disease like the virus, who have not been able to bring our children indoors and keep them there in the numbers that we need to. Our people have always had to go out, make things work and possible for other people. And therefore, in a pandemic like this one, that is, one, not clearly understood yet, seems to be so free in its attacking whomever comes in contact, until we can create an environment where it's not just us who are the ones that suffer the most from the kind of injustice that exists in our society, but when the laws, policies, and efforts that have been demonstrated from the beginning of time in America, from the development of the first set of laws and policies that were designed to deny us equal justice and equal rights, until that is understood and corrected, we'll always have a bit of a problem talking together honestly with each other about these things. But in an academy like your environment, your campuses there, where people are learning, talking, can create an environment of honesty and truth, can be willing to really study, to read, and to talk together and discuss things and try to get rid of that, the orientation that our society so freely shares, and that's making it difficult to appreciate the difference that the system has created, and to encourage. I just hope, I have such high hope for our academies, because I believe that our students are scholars and want to know not just about chemistry and math and other subjects like that, but want to also know the root cause of so much of what we have to continue to fight for. I think about, my friends, the fact that we were able to pass the first in the nation fair housing legislation, and yet we're still fighting it. That was back in 1962. We're here in 2020, and we're still trying to achieve equality in housing, in job opportunity, in education, and somehow we miss the opportunity for clarity, directness, and honesty. And we find ourselves slipping back to having to teach all over again justice and equality. So I think we'll get there. I don't mean to be discouraging the effort. I just think it needs to be, we need to really see if we can be as honest as possible, and to be unafraid, ask questions, share real views and attitudes, and test it, see what we can do. And I think your campuses can do that. You've been at it a long time. I remember a long time ago when I was invited. I don't mean just March, I mean years ago, and know the sincerity of the staff there and the effort there and the students. And we just need to keep reminding ourselves that we are possible.
Dr. Johnson,
Hello.
I'm so excited that you'll be able to come to campus because I want to have an opportunity for you to actually truly engage with our folks on campus instead of this question and answer period.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to that. Don't forget. Don't forget.
Don't worry, Deborah and I, we never forget. We're like elephants.
Thank you.
I have one last question, and this is, and I'll read it to you.
All right.
All right. So this question reads, how can we communicate with others in an effective, meaningful, and constructive manner? It is especially hard for me, the person who asked the question, a woman of color, to speak up about these issues at a predominantly white institution with confidence. How can I converse with others so that I can plant the seeds of change in them instead of engaging in a conversation that leads nowhere?
Oh, that's such a good question. The other day, my friends, I was listening to an African American woman talk about, it was on the radio, I can't remember what program I was listening to, but her talk about the difficulty of just trying to be human and not having to always try to explain how she feels and who she is and from whence she's come. And she was hoping that there would be a time in her life when she didn't always feel that she needed to explain who she is and how she feels. And I think that's the basis of your question is, how do you, a Black woman in a white environment, a white Christian environment, really feel that you are a part of it? And you don't always have to be the one who is trying to explain us collectively to others. And I think it's not easy, because even in 2020, and I referenced that 2020, how far I thought we might be as a nation in 2020, having been observant and engaged in us as a nation for such a long time. As someone said in the introduction, at age 13 or 12 or 14, sometimes you forget the exact number, I was going door to door with my father in Houston, Texas, to try to get people to petition to be able to do away with poll tax. And here we are in 2020 the understanding of that is still not very clear. So we end up still talking about it. Because when you, my students, were in elementary, junior, and senior high, I'm not sure we as teachers were able to give you the kind of information or give your fellow students the information that they needed in order to communicate with you and you with them in a normal, natural way. Because we still have an environment that creates hesitancy for us to ask questions that we don't know and to try to talk together in language that we don't know is offensive or not. And I think academies have the opportunity to create an environment in which we're not trying. I've given up on trying to assume that a whole classroom or several grades of students and, that we can gather together and talk. I think we have to be more sensitive to the fact that the world we have is a one that's been created from the beginning, and laws that we have passed don't seem to be sticking very well in the general public. So, and depending on the leadership of people who are trying to help direct us and fulfill our dreams and aspirations, if that leader or those leaders are not committed to that same goal, we find ourselves still trying to talk to each other in language that's foreign. And by that I mean, by foreign, is that we don't fully understand what are we trying to say to each other and why. And then how do we clarify language that has been created to cause confusion and division? How do we develop a sense of security in who we are, us, people of color and of different orientation? How do we feel free in an environment where we know there are these questions that people have, but don't quite know how to ask and discuss them? And they've been going on so long, for so many generations, that we're not sure we know how to converse with each other because it somehow has stuck in the system and it's very hard to unstick. But forming little conversation groups so you can feel free to talk and our brothers and sisters who are there at our colleges and in our various environments where they are the one or the two are clearly the minority, that they don't have to feel that they're educating the community, or that they have to be careful in how they are able to interact with their colleagues, their friends, the people, that they will be heard, understood, and the history of America is known by them and others, and our friends and our fellow students and faculty and administrators understand what has gone before and what needs to be done now. 2020, I was born in 1930, and here we are, 2020, and we're still having to try to understand how to, as our sister there says, a woman of color in an environment that may need to understand what it means to be in an environment where you feel that you are one or a few in an environment and in a culture that may not really see you or hear you. And I guess I continue to have faith and hope that our struggle as a nation, as a people, as people who believe in some kind of spiritual direction, will be able to talk together, visit together, and move on to a society that is open and just. I keep hoping. When my great granddaughter was born 6 weeks ago, I said, I pray she doesn't have to go through what her great grandma had to go through, and that the world will be a little fairer, more just, open, and permit her to be the very best she can be. And that's what we all hope, I know.
That's a wonderful amen moment. That's really great, Dr. Johnson. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was perfect.
Thank you. That means a lot to me coming from you, Ken. So thank you very much.
Well, we could go for another hour and a half with all of the questions that our attendees have asked, but that, of course, reinforces our intent of your coming back and spending time with us. And we hope that it would be a live audience at that time, but we really appreciate your taking the time, and with your giving us the faith and the hope in the future. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our sponsors. Thank you, Ken Jones and President McAllister, President Heyman, Jonathan, thank you so much. Matt Lindstrom, thank you as well. And we are so honored Dr. Johnson, to have you give us your words of wisdom and encouragement for the future. Thank you so much, and we look forward to having you again in the future.
Thank you, Deborah. And I appreciate the fact that you got me back to our campus, and I look forward to the return. So I'm going to pray that I stay healthy and will last a little bit longer, because I'd love to come back and visit with our community.
Beautiful. We would love to have you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to all our attendees.
Yeah, thank you, all of you. I appreciate all that you did to make this happen tonight. I'm thankful, and God is good.
Great. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thank you.